Hi, and welcome to the new reality of securing healthcare. My name is Jeanette Wider, and I'm managing editor of Healthcare Innovation. I'm here with Richard Stannings today. So why don't we begin by you introducing yourself, Richard, your title, your role, your background?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jeanette, for inviting me to this session here today. So I'm Richard Stannings. I'm Chief Security Strategist with Cylera. Cylera is a biomedical healthcare informatics IoT company based out of New York. We go about securing the Internet of Medical Things, or the healthcare IoT, as it's sometimes called as well. I'm also a professor of cybersecurity and healthcare informatics at the University of Denver University College, and happy to be here today to share my thoughts, my visions for the future, as it were, and my understanding of what's happening in the space today.
Right. So as we all know, there's been a crazy shift since COVID and the pandemic, and with the intensifying threat vectors and the shifting landscape, basically, of cybersecurity in healthcare. And one thing I hear time and time again is that organizations should have a good foundation. So let's talk about the importance of, let's say, the simple things that organizations may be missing.
Yeah, so cybersecurity is really the combination of people, process, and technology, right? That means you need a decent team, a cybersecurity team of individuals with the requisite skill sets, pardon me, to secure your organization. You need decent processes that can be universally followed by all staff, not just security and IT staff, and you need decent technologies that you can leverage in order to help the defense of the realm, whether you're a large integrated care provider, whether you're a small cottage hospital, critical access facility, or you're a single person general practice primary care physician, right? So, or someone in ancillary services, right, that provides imaging services or pharmaceutical services. These sorts of things. We're all under attack. We're all facing increased challenges in securing our businesses and protecting our patients from a growing tide of cybercrime and nefarious cyber actors. I think it's important that we look at this problem holistically, and I think that's where cybersecurity frameworks like the NIST CSF come into play, and obviously, from an international perspective, ISO 27001, 27002, the CIS, CSC frameworks, which are used in order to look at the risks that organizations face and to put in place the people, process, and technology required in order to protect that. There's no point spending all of your money on the world's most fantastic identity access management system, as some healthcare systems did 10 years ago, if you can't afford to put in place some of the other basic blocking and tackling. But in cybersecurity, I think what we're seeing is that actors are being incredibly adaptive, incredibly fickle in their approach, and they're looking for gaps in our overall framework, which is why we need that holistic approach that is all-encompassing in order to secure our enterprises.
Okay, so let's say you work in an organization, obviously, and you already have an existing infrastructure. What are some tips for our audience about how to maybe secure some stuff on their network a little bit better? Or maybe how can we talk to leaders about using what we already have and improving to stop these bad actors from coming in?
I think there's a lot that we could be doing in the healthcare delivery space, and indeed the payer space as well, to improve cybersecurity. But I think there's some fundamental concerns. One is that we are playing a massive game of catch-up here. There is a cybersecurity debt in healthcare going back at least 20 years, 10 in perhaps some of the more, the better funded, more advanced healthcare delivery organizations that have really tackled this over the last decade. But we plainly haven't invested enough in the people, process, and technology that we need in order to secure our environments and to protect our patients, right? This is a fundamental concern to all of us in this particular space. And that goes back really to understanding the paradigm of the technology and the delivery mechanisms that we use in order to deliver care to patients. Well, I go back 20 years, I've been in the space for 30, but I go back 20 years ago to a time when, a consult with your primary care physician involved, a manila file, a pen, and actually talking to the doctor rather, face to face, rather than the doctor turning around on his laptop and entering data into a terminal that then was placed into, the electronic medical record. It was a different time with different risks. We have digitalized our healthcare systems, particularly in the United States, but all countries to some degree. As a result of that digitalization, we have changed the way that physicians interact or clinicians interact with patients, and the way that medical information, PHI, PII, is stored in our systems. It's digital. It's easy to steal large quantities of this data versus having to back up a massive truck and download, caseloads of manila files to the back of that truck in order to steal it, and then have someone go through and look for the juicy bits that may be valuable that could be monetized. It's now, very easy to break into a healthcare provider, steal vast quantities of data, and monetize that within a couple of days. And that is obviously a lucrative proposition. So, we've got a confidentiality problem. I'll come back to some of the availability and integrity problems a little bit later on today, but the paradigm has changed. We are dependent on the digital tools that we use in order to render care to patients. It's no longer a question of stick a thermometer under your tongue and have a conversation with a doctor or a nurse, as it was 20 or 30 years ago. We are now wholly reliant upon the technology to deliver the best possible outcomes to our patients. And we've seen this when systems go down. When health IT systems go down, doctors, particularly younger doctors, stumble, right? Nurses stumble as, how do I chart a patient if I don't have the application up and running in order to do that? How do I know what drugs this patient has been prescribed? How do I know their past patient history? Because there's no manila file in front of me, and it takes me, several hours at least to get a backup from that system out of my EMR, unless I'm very well tuned in that respect. So we have a reliance upon technology for safe patient diagnosis and treatment. We have a reliance upon technology for so many things in healthcare now that exposes us to risks. And yet we are continuing to evolve that technology. The pace of transformation in healthcare delivery is astronomical, and it's growing at an exponential rate. Digital interoperability is a buzzword that's been favored for the last decade, but is increasing in scope and size and overall magnitude, right? And as we continue to transform the technology and tools that we use to render care to patients, so the gap between those technologies that we've implemented and the cybersecurity controls necessary to protect those new technologies is growing, right? And that is leading to an attacker's arbitrage within that gap, right? The more technology we continue to race forward and implement, and the longer it takes us to back in security controls into that solution set, the wider the gap is, and the more opportunity there is for nefarious actors, nation states, organized crime to reap havoc on our systems. Instead of designing security in from the onset around these new tools, we've got a process of strap-on, right? A process of latent security controls being added or adapted to these new technologies. And what we need to do is to use our security frameworks to design in those controls from the outset, and to make sure that security goes hand in hand with the implementation of new technologies. But at the same time, we've got that 20-year backlog that we need to go back and fill in the gaps with. Otherwise, we're going to continue to be exposed.
Right. So I think this is a good segue to talk about maybe some of the trends you've been seeing. You're a world traveler, you're all over the place. So can you share some of the latest trends you've been hearing from around the world and the level of preparedness, or perhaps I should say lack thereof, that you're seeing among senior healthcare IT leaders and patient care organizations?
Yeah, I was talking to a colleague in the UK this morning, actually, about the state of cybersecurity in the UK. And the good news for for American healthcare providers is that we are not alone, right? The more than 100% increase in cyber attacks over the last year is reflected globally, right? It's happening in Australia, it's happening in Singapore, it's happening in Japan, it's right the way across Europe. And I think this is caused by the pivot that we in the healthcare industry have had to undergo in terms of our approach to providing services to patients. COVID changed the paradigm, right? It shook things up, and it brought about more drastic and dramatic rapid change in the healthcare delivery model than any innovative CTO could have dreamt of, quite frankly, right? We've had all of these technologies on the back burner that we've been looking at for many years, like telehealth and telemedicine, and we've dragged our feet on the implementation of these types of remote patient services, right? COVID forced us to rethink this. It forced us to rethink how we deliver safe and effective consults to patients, how we bring only those who really need to be on site in our hospitals on-prem, and what technologies we have in order to render care to patients. And I think that has provided, that quick pivot has created gaps in our security infrastructure. It's created gaps in our governance of enterprise risk management across healthcare, and I include patient safety in that as probably the most important aspect of enterprise risk management for any healthcare delivery organization. And we have yet to catch up. So it's akin really to that attackers arbitrage that I mentioned earlier, in that we pivoted very quickly, and then we've been trying to backfill those security controls to make sure that we're not exposing our hospitals to risks by having most of our non-clinical workforce working from their homes environments, right? Or we're not exposing our hospitals to additional risks as a result of telehealth and telemedicine consults, and by exposing applications to the internet in order for patients to interact with us. And I think that comes back to, it's embodied in one or two major concerns. I think firstly, there is a need for greater role of government to protect critical infrastructures like cybersecurity. We've seen that with the Colonial Pipeline attack, another critical infrastructure industry in the United States. We've seen that with multiple attacks on multiple healthcare systems across the world. And we've seen patient deaths as a result of ransomware attacks in Germany and the United States, and probably many more that haven't yet surfaced. But this is the state of play, and attacks against a population generally invoke a response or the need for governments in order to step in and to offer protective capabilities around that. So that's the first point. The second point is really, I think that hospital leaders, CEOs and boards of directors have been so consumed with keeping their organizations financially afloat, when the revenue streams of elective surgery, which is what most US healthcare revenue, where most US healthcare revenue comes from, those streams have dried up under COVID. And as a result, there's been a lot of pivoting, a lot of rethinking, a lot of focus on how do we keep our enterprise alive. And I think they probably need to take a lot closer look at the risks, the enterprise risks to healthcare delivery organizations, particularly cybersecurity, because cybersecurity and patient safety are now inextricably linked, right? If I attack the IT systems of a hospital, it's no longer just an inconvenience or a slap on the wrist and a fine and an investigation by HHS OCR. It's, hey, FBI turning up on your doorstep to investigate patient murders or patient deaths that were attributed to some form of cyber attack. And that's highly unfortunate, but it's the reality in which we live. And I think cybersecurity needs to take a much higher level of priority in our leaders' plans for how we go about reinventing healthcare for the post-COVID world.
All right, I want to circle back to something you said about telehealth and the new healthcare delivery paradigm. Obviously, everything has changed, and personally, I've used telehealth, and I don't want to go back. You know what I'm saying? But how can we make sure that when an organization is offering telehealth that we're doing it safely? Because the new perimeter is really the home. How can this be avoided? You know, these bad actors getting in through a whole new channel now.
And I think, firstly, that you're not alone, Jeanette. You know, we all pivoted towards telehealth, and most of us liked it, right? You know, there's a few older people that like to, and I'm not picking on the elderly, but my mother loves to go along and have a chat with her general practitioner every so often. It's kind of like a day out for her in many respects, right? But some people prefer face-to-face contact. But I think there's a lot that you can do via telehealth just as effectively, in fact, more efficiently than you can do in a face-to-face consult. You know, so I'm not going to get into the types of treatment areas, but you know, simple thing. You know, I've got a strep throat. I need some drugs. Have a look at my tonsils. You know, via the camera. Prescribe me what I need. Send the prescription to my local pharmacy. And you know, I'll go along and pick it up, or I'll send a family member along to go pick it up, or they can deliver it to my doorstep, right, by drone or whatever they're doing these days. I haven't actually had that yet, but I've heard of it. So I think I think telehealth and telemedicine is not going away, right? There will be a large percentage of the population that will prefer that mode of treatment than, you know, making an appointment, driving to the doctor's office through the snow or the rain or the hurricane or whatever's going on outside, and you know, waiting 30 minutes because we, for the life of us, can't get our workflows to work well in US healthcare. And if you show up, you know, on time, there's a very low probability that you're going to be seen on time. It's just the way things work, right? Why would you want to do that when you can sit in your armchair, sit at your desk, and you know, at 4 o'clock comes around and it's, oh, I've got a doctor's appointment. There we go. Log in. Hello, doctor. How are you? I've got this strep throat. Take a look. Give me some meds so that I can, you know, get better. So a lot of this is going to stay, and I think a lot of exceptions to some of the rules that were in place before COVID were made. There were exemptions that were made around the use of telehealth and telemedicine. There were a lot of concerns about the security of these technologies because they weren't encrypted before COVID. And you and I are talking on an encrypted Zoom session today, which means that, you know, our communication is relatively secure, and one could talk about the nature of the encryption being used, or the fact that it's Zoom, you know, which is developed overseas rather than in the United States, and raise a whole load of other questions around that. But I think those exceptions are still in place. I foresee that there will need to be a continuing evaluation of the technologies that are being used to deliver telehealth, telemedicine, and a list of, you know, acceptable technologies that are embodied into future healthcare regulations, permanent healthcare regulations, rather than the temporary ones we have today. So there's plainly some role for government agencies to step in here to evaluate the new reality and to make sure that rules and regulations are in place to ensure that this new technology is secured appropriately.
So the next thing I'd like to talk about too is there's been an increase in AI attacks and dark web sophistication. It just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. Do you have any tips for organizations to stay on top of what's seemingly increasingly sophisticated challenges?
Yeah, so there is an arms race that's going on between the perpetrators of cybercrime and cyber defenders, the security professionals that go about protecting our hospitals and other providers. We in the defensive space are already outnumbered 5 to 1. There are 5 times as many perpetrators of cybercrime as there are defenders. So we're in an immediate disadvantage. Secondly, they only need to be successful one time in order to gain a foothold onto our healthcare networks. And we need to ensure 100% success all the time at keeping them out. So we have a much, much bigger surface area to protect. They just need to find one chink in our armor in order to break in. It's kind of like, you know, pulling a stone out of a dike, right? And you can essentially cause a flood as a result of that. Whereas, you know, the people protecting that dike need to make sure they've got eyes on every stone right the way throughout the length of the dike. And this is plainly a tough battle to fight, but we're doing what we can. There's an escalation around the tools that are being used in order to find those chinks in the armor and in order to remove those stones to our dikes in order to breach those dams. We're seeing increasing use of artificial intelligence-based tools, the weaponization of existing ransomware tools, the weaponization of existing DDoS tools, of other types of tools, using artificial intelligence in order to get by the types of defensive controls that we have placed with, you know, our perimeter controls, our advanced malware protection, and endpoint protection, host intrusion detection capabilities, because these tools are able to emulate normal methods of behavior to the extent that anomalies are not raised by our defensive security tools. I want to talk about business email compromise as kind of a juncture here. Business email compromise is where someone purports to be the CFO or the CEO of an organization, sends messages to someone in accounting to change the bank account of a payment, a large payment that needs to go through to someone, or to raise a PO in order to you know, to make a false payment. We're now seeing artificial intelligence being used to perfectly emulate the voices of senior executives in companies and to leave voicemails for individuals in accounting, such that they say, "Oh, holy crap, the CEO just called me telling me that I need to wire this money immediately," and they don't have processes in place to validate that was the CEO. They recognize the voice, and there may be a follow-up email coming from the CEO's email address, fake one at that, that, you know, reinforces this. They don't actually go and check on an individual third person or call up the CEO's admin to say, did he or she authorize this particular change in payment? We're seeing AI used in that sort of technology, in that sort of attack vector. We're seeing that used in video attack vectors to make politicians say things on television, or famous actors say things on video clips that they didn't say. And we're even able to bring back the dead to say things in movies that plainly they didn't, you know, record before their death in 1950 or whenever it was, right? We have these technologies at our disposal. They can be used for very good purposes, but they can also be used for very nefarious purposes. And we're seeing a lot of offensive offensive tools being AI enabled. So I think we need to get a step in front of the bad guys here by looking at how can we AI enable our defensive tools so that we have defensive AI that can compete and block and tackle the offensive AI that is now being thrown at us. This is kind of the point of the iceberg right now, as it were. There's a lot more that's going to be coming down the road very shortly, in my opinion, from what I've seen. And you know, we plainly need to prepare for it. The tools we have in our toolkits today will not defend us against the attacks of tomorrow, and that requires us to rethink our entire security paradigm. And I think there are certain things that we take for granted today in healthcare delivery that need to change. Healthcare networks were designed as flat networks to facilitate clinician access to whatever system, to whatever record, whenever it was needed in order to render care to a patient. And while we still need some kind of break glass mechanism in order to gain for a physician to legitimately access the system when needed in order to save patient lives, we plainly need to put in place better controls, better segmentation, particularly with regard to the types of technology that we're seeing on our networks today. Things like healthcare IoT, like the growth of medical devices, which already outnumber traditional IT assets on our network by a factor of 3 to 1, and that's growing every single year. We need to segment those devices. We need to segment our networks so that we have more of a zero trust approach to security, so that we can no longer access whatever we want as a clinician or an IT professional or a security professional whenever we want, but we need to do so on the basis of need to know, on the basis of prior authorization, and on the basis of zero trust but verified.
Right. So I'll come back to the next few years because I'm definitely interested in what you have to say about that. But another question we get a lot is how can, one, if I'm working at a hospital, how can I get C-suite support and most importantly, funding for this? I'd hate to say we have to wait until something bad happens, but sometimes I'm hearing we have to wait until one of the bad actors gets in to really get the support from the upper level people.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that drive executive prioritization and decision making around the space. Plainly, regulation has been one. There was very, very limited security around healthcare before HIPAA came into place in the early 2000s. People started to think about it back in '96 when HIPAA was, in its final draft stages and eventually implemented. But it really took regulation to bring around increased spend, increased hiring, better tools, better processes, and making people adhere to more secure way of operating. I remember having arguments with physicians in hospitals around the strength of their password. One particular physician, who I won't mention by name, I think he's still practicing, insisted on maintaining his 1234 password on his computer terminal that he used to access medical records and even to prescribe drugs to patients. And when I implemented strong password controls in order to meet HIPAA security rules, this physician threatened to pick up his practice and move it to a different hospital, which he eventually did until they implemented strong password controls. And then he came back with his tail between his legs. We've had to kind of push people a little bit. It's a combination of carrot and stick. Meaningful use was a bit more of a carrot than a stick. It incentivized healthcare organizations to facilitate the meaningful exchange of health information between different providers, and there were monetary sums that were made available in order to facilitate that digitalization. I think we probably need a combination of both of those in order to kind of drive forward the types of security that we need to protect patient safety and the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of health information for the post-COVID era. So I think regulation is one area. I think the other area is really risk. And we're beginning to see the cost of loss become a critical factor in the decision-making of healthcare boards. And we're seeing this particularly around breach insurance. Breach insurance is being used as kind of a placebo, as an alternative to resiliency, paying for resiliency in the healthcare space. Do I address these risks that my annual risk assessment has brought up? Or do I just buy increased health breach insurance in the case that I'm going to be breached? And a lot of senior executives and boards of directors kind of took the easy road and said, I think the possibility of us being attacked is fairly remote. Therefore, let's just rely on our cyber breach insurance rather than spend millions of dollars putting in place the types of controls that we probably should do. But we don't have the budget for it. We've got a new outpatient wing that we're launching next year, and that's going to cost us billions of dollars or millions of dollars. We've got all of this new equipment we need to purchase. These are potential revenue generating opportunities, whereas cybersecurity is a cost of doing business, and therefore is less important than those new revenue streams. I think COVID has turned the paradigm of healthcare delivery upside down. People no longer want to go to a new outpatient clinic. They want telehealth, right? That's plainly reflected by your opinion and by what we're seeing with patients voting with their feet, consumers of medical services. And I think what's also compounding this is the fact that breach insurance is no longer covering the types of risks that we're seeing, right? When you look at a cyber breach, okay, there are damages, there are fines, there's restitution, there's corrective action plans, there's loss of reputation, the list goes on and on. There's cost of recovery, cost of forensic investigation. Insurance will only cover part of that, right? And breach insurance premiums are going up by an order of magnitude every year, so it seems, depending upon the types of security controls that you have in place. Now, that's a good thing, because I think it's saying to the insurers are getting smarter, and they're saying, what security controls do you have in place? What can you show me in order to buy down your premiums? In other words, spend money on resiliency and spend money on cybersecurity in order to reduce the money you spend on your breach insurance. They're also coming back and saying, when a breach does occur, they're also saying there's a factor of contributory negligence at play here, right? You were negligent because you didn't have XYZ basic security controls in place, as you should have, and therefore, of the $3 million that we agreed to pay you in the event of a breach, we're reducing that by $2 million because you were negligent and you didn't have the types of controls in place in order to reduce the impact of this particular attack. So that's one thing. Another thing is that the punitive damages in these breaches are going far beyond any level of breach insurance. Patients, particularly in some of the more litigious states, are demanding millions of dollars for the types of errors that hospitals are making by their inadequate security. There's an article you wrote about recently, Jeanette, about a baby that died as a result of IT systems not being available to recognize that the umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck prior to delivery because the ultrasound systems were down because of a ransomware attack. Plainly, and I'm not going to get into the rights and wrongs of what the hospital did there, that's for the courts to decide, but plainly there was some element of negligence on the part of the healthcare provider that resulted in that patient death, and that patient's parents are suing for millions of dollars, and I think many other patients are also suing for very large sums of money that are essentially end of game sums of money for cash-strapped healthcare providers. I remember predicting some years ago class action lawsuit for a large California healthcare provider. It was in the $4 billion range, and basically saying, based upon the number of patients, patient records that were exposed, if we saw larger breaches, then that would actually close down some health systems. And we've seen larger breaches, and I think the courts have been quite lenient in terms of the sums awarded for restitution as a result of that. But plainly, you can't keep paying out large sums of money in restitution for endless breaches. And the types of attacks we're seeing are getting bigger, they're getting more impactful, and they're getting more hurting to patients, and patients are demanding action.
Well, we have just a few minutes left, so the last thing I want to ask you is your outlook for the next few years in just a minute or two for our audience.
Okay, so get your razor blades out, folks, and hold your wrists. No, it's I don't want to paint a doom and gloom picture here. I want to talk about the positives that we can actually focus upon. Plainly, there is a rise in cyber attacks against the healthcare industry. Anyone who hasn't seen that needs to probably read a little bit more about what's going on and talk to their colleagues. We need to reposition healthcare. We need to rethink our approach to patient safety and cybersecurity. We need to rethink that within the new constraints of and the new patterns of healthcare delivery, so that we're putting in place protective measures. I think that involves some level of zero trust. I think that involves networks, increased levels of network and application isolation and segmentation. I think that's understanding a more asset-based risk approach to cybersecurity, so we understand what connects to our networks and our extended networks, because it's not just what's in the hospital plugged into an RJ45 port. It's what connects wirelessly, it's what connects via Bluetooth, it's what connects via serial port or on-prem, and it's what patients take home with them. COVID has shown us that patients can be monitored and managed and treated from the confines of their home. And many countries like Australia has a mandate which allows, which basically requires healthcare providers to allow that patient to die at home and to provide all the medical equipment that's necessary in order to keep that patient comfortable for the last 6 months of their lives, you know, surrounded by their pets and photographs and their relatives, rather than in a sterile, you know, fluorescent lit, you know, hospital ward in a public hospital somewhere. We now have medical wearables that most of us have, an Apple Watch strapped on our hand that measures our level of activity or inactivity. In the case of some of us, it measures our blood pressure, even our EKG, right? This is the expanded surface area of healthcare delivery, and I don't think we've adapted yet to that new reality. And I think we need to take a step back as not just as cybersecurity leaders and technology leaders, but also as senior executives of the providers of those services to say, okay, this is the way we've always treated patients. This paradigm no longer exists. It's been crushed. We now have this new paradigm in which we operate. Let's understand what the constraints are of this new operating model, and let's put in place the types of controls that are necessary to ensure patient safety and to ensure resiliency of our highly interoperative IT systems that we are using to deliver care to patients. Let's understand the risks and let's put in place the appropriate risk mitigation measures so that we can continue to provide services safely, effectively, efficiently, keep our customers happy, our patients, keep governments happy, and keep perpetrators of cybercrime outside of our realms.
Great, well said, well put. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you again for being here today and talking with me. I really appreciate it, Richard.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, for allowing me to share a few thoughts here.